All right. Well, good afternoon. Thanks so much for being here. We are recording this session, and also captions are available if you need them. You can just access them through that CC button at the bottom of your screen. This is Educate and Act. This is a series that is hosted by the Emily Taylor Center for Women and Gender Equity, the Center for Service Learning, and also the Commons. And my name is Emily Ryan. I'm the director of the Commons. So I want to extend a special thanks to Kate Kemper at the Center for Service Learning and also Melinda Lewis in the School of Social Welfare, who worked with me on organizing this event and whose idea it was to host this topic. So thank you so much for your help. We created this series, the three original partners created the series in the spring of 2020, seeing the number of important moments coming and wanting a way to offer KU students and the community ways to not only learn more about the opportunities to participate in democracy, but also ways to put their knowledge into action. So we began the series with an event about the census, and since then, in the promotion for this event, you probably saw this is the 14th event in the series. So since then, we've covered a lot of topics, including things like barriers to democratic participation for underrepresented populations, impending climate policy, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and most recently, organizing efforts around the August 2020 election and vote on the text amendment about reproductive rights. So as we have developed this series, it's been really important to bring together the voices from our community as well as from KU, reflecting the ways in which research and learning have direct application to the world beyond that of higher education. And we've highlighted student voices as much as possible so that it's apparent to fellow students that there are ways to get involved at all levels in this. Today we are embarking on a conversation about misinformation and global democracy. And I want to extend my thanks to you all for being here and committing to learning more with us. I want to introduce our speakers today, and they will each offer a short presentation about their own relationship to identifying misinformation, observing trends, making resources accessible to thwart the further spread of misinformation. And then after that, we'll move into moderated questions and then audience questions if you've got them. So first off, we're lucky to have three student presenters, all of whom are members of the KU debate team. This hallowed debate team, which I have never met in person, so I'm very excited to meet a few of you right now. But Jet Semrick, Sabrina Yang, and Michael Scott. And they will speak a little bit more about their own experiences with developing arguments, finding holes and faulty ones, and why the skills that they hone through debate are important. And then we'll hear from Tarun Sabarwal, a professor in the Department of Economics and the director of the Center for Analytical Research in Economics, who has published recently on the patterns and spread of misinformation, how we've seen that play out on a national scale, and how we might expect it to continue if there's no intervention. Finally, we will hear from Carmen Orthe-Alfie, who is a KU librarian and who has created LibGuides to misinformation, how to identify it, how to do better media research, how not to fall victim to misinformation. And I know that Carmen will offer a lot of resources for us today. After we hear from each presenter, our moderator, Melinda Lewis, who is Associate Professor of the Practice in the School of Social Welfare, and who is the Associate Director of the school's Center on Community Engagement and Collaboration, will offer some questions for our speakers. And then, as I said, there will be some time for audience questions. So you can be thinking about that as you hear the presentations and discussion. You can either use the chat to send it to the big group. You can private message Melinda or me and we'll get them to the group. Or you can just raise your hand so that you can speak the question aloud. And then I'll be back in the last minute to wrap us up and offer my thanks once again for being here. But at this point, I will hand it over to Jet, Michael, and Sabrina.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Emily. I'm going to be speaking first on behalf of the debate team. So we're kind of going to talk about three main things. First, I'm going to talk about just the risk that misinformation pose and kind of global and national trends that we're seeing about that. Sabrina will talk about the specific impacts that misinformation is having on things like democracy, public health, et cetera. And then Jet is really going to focus on the things that we've learned in debate and the skills and strategies we've learned that can help to counter this. So just kind of to start as an overview, misinformation is defined as false or inaccurate information which is similar but slightly distinct from disinformation, which is deliberately misleading false information. And both of these things are a huge global problem. More than 80% of people surveyed across the globe in 2021 said that misinformation was a problem in their country. So it's not just something affecting the United States, it's something, as we'll talk about more later, that has affected public trust in election results, ranging from Nigeria recently to Brazil and even to the United States. And it's also been linked to things like a lack of trust in vaccines and public health failures connected to COVID-19. So it's a very important topic that we're discussing today. So first, I kind of wanted to go over like the causes of misinformation, because I think understanding that is important for understanding like what solutions need to kind of like focus on and cover. So the first and like most obvious cause that we need to talk about is the rise of social media. So social media has become like a key and even like kind of the main source of news for people globally and in the United States. A 2021 Pew Research survey found that 86% of Americans get their news from their smartphone. And this is like a major change from the past, when people were typically getting their news from like the newspaper or from like one or two major like television channels. This has been like a huge cause of widespread misinformation, since while stories in the newspaper and on television are typically like fact checked, reviewed, etc., on social media, you have no idea where that news is coming from, the credibility of that source, etc. And social media specifically tends to amplify this like fake news effect, since attention grabbing and controversial headlines are going to like generate more engagement on social media feeds, and that's going to like show up in more and more people's feeds, exposing more and more people to misinformation. And the big issue with that is that people are generally not the best at identifying misinformation when they see it, and really like recognizing how to interrogate the credibility of a source and the like factfulness of like certain information. We also see like the rise of bots on social media that are able to spread information at a large scale and create false perceptions of like support for misinformed views. Another kind of thing we need to talk about with misinformation that connects to why it is so like hard to counter and to correct is the rise of political polarization and specialized media sources. So while Americans used to get their news from like one or two main like national sources, media is now split into like specialized networks like CNN, Fox News, etc. And political polarization is just something that is increasing at a worldwide scale. And this is a major problem for countering misinformation, since it drives individuals to seek out information that supports their side and demeans the other side at nearly all costs, which makes individuals like really willing to accept misinformation if it supports their side. And it becomes really hard for social media sites and other like political actors to correct misinformed views when people so strongly connect it to like their partisan beliefs. We've seen some efforts to correct misinformation. We've seen social media sites add like fact checks to potentially like to potential misinformation and other misinformation warning mechanisms. But there have been a lot of studies over this recently showing mixed results of these policies, and a lot of like kind of like elite narratives and elite efforts to kind of like discredit these efforts by social media sites. So overall, misinformation is like a major risk that's happening in the United States and globally that is very hard to contain. However, there definitely is some hope in this area. This is something like personally, I've come across a lot of like misinformation in my debate research and even seen it on social media. However, there are like clear individual strategies that you can take, such as like checking source credibility, looking towards like peer-reviewed sources, as we like tend to in debate, doing more individual research on a certain topic to learn more about it, etc., which my colleagues will talk about more. Thank you.
Now I will be talking about the specific dangers of misinformation, especially like Michael said, especially with the widespread use of social media and technology. It's super important to be aware that we're always at risk at spreading or at risk of consuming misinformation. People can easily access content, but that also means that people can easily access or publish content themselves without any research or peer reviews, which means that it's super important to always be aware of what kind of content that we're consuming ourselves. It leads to significant impacts that affect people broadly and not just at a localized level. An easy example is in the sector of public health specifically. Prior to COVID, there was some controversy about vaccines in general. Some people wouldn't vaccinate their children after birth because there were some misconceptions about the effects of vaccines. There were some rumors that vaccines could cause autism, things like that, and it put their own children, who are very vulnerable, at risk of all these different viruses and diseases. Post-COVID, I think misinformation spread in a multitude of ways, and these issues were only exacerbated. Once again, there's a lot of debate on vaccines themselves. People thought a lot of different things. Some people thought that it didn't work. Other people thought that it weren't important, and other people thought that vaccines were like a microchip from the government to track us, things like that. And misinformation like this deterred people from getting vaccinated in the first place, which only prolonged the pandemic, and it led to our response as a nation as a whole being ineffective to the pandemic in general. There's also a lot of controversy over masks and their effectiveness. A lot of people thought that it didn't change anything and that they weren't effective. But there were a lot of scientific studies backing up the efficacy of masks themselves, but people chose to ignore them because of misinformation from social media posts or from influencers and from people posting on social media with their misguided views in the first place. I think this led to a lot of people overlooking how serious the pandemic was in the first place. A lot of people eventually caught COVID-19 because of their dismissal of because of the dismissal of things like vaccines and masks, which ultimately led to a lot of people unfortunately passing away, or them catching like prolonged health serious effects that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. It also prolonged the pandemic previously, which means that a lot of people lost their jobs, which meant that a lot of families couldn't provide for their own children or themselves. A lot of people weren't able to provide food. They couldn't pay rent, which means that not only did it affect their health, but it also affected the economy as a whole. It affected the standard of living for the nation in general. The discussions of the origins of COVID-19 also led to a lot of heightened racism and also xenophobia, and it also led to an increase in hate crimes. There was a 9% uptick in the number of Asian hate crimes. Previously, it was about 30%, but then during COVID-19, there was about 39% of Asian Americans reported experiencing a hate crime due to controversies with COVID-19. Public health is just one example. It's the easy example to look to, but we can also see misinformation affecting other areas like democracy and foreign policy. Things like misinformed voters often lead to misguided or unprepared policymakers being voted in, which often leads to ineffective or harmful bills and policies that are passed. A lot of times at local elections or local levels, people don't do their research before actually going and vote, which means that oftentimes they don't know who they're voting for, what kind of policies the people that they're voting for believe in, their value systems, things like that, which often means that oftentimes policymakers don't represent the people's wants and needs and desires, but rather policymakers pass things that are often detrimental to a lot of groups that are overlooked. Which means that it's important to know what we're voting for to prevent misinformed votings and bad policies.
Yeah, I'm going to wrap up with talking about kind of how the skills and policy debate can help combat misinformation. One thing that's really cool about debate is it's kind of an activity that is like playing chess with research and different articles that you research over a certain topic. And so in debate, we prioritize things like ethics, providing citations, not misquoting authors, and doing our best to find people who are qualified to defend our arguments. And what it means to be qualified can be extremely different depending on kind of what you're advocating for. But as Michael said, one important quality that we prioritize is finding peer-reviewed articles and kind of using that as the best metric to determine if an author is qualified or not. Some of my favorite authors personally are, op-ed writers, people who just post on Twitter about different issues, but those types of things might not be the best things to cite in debate because oftentimes they're not peer-reviewed. They haven't gone through a rigorous research process, which can be something that's really important when you're discerning information that is true or might have some sort of bias. Peer review is usually out there. It's able to determine if something is incorrect and in most cases, you're able to find out if some information is flawed or has some problem. There is oftentimes someone out there who's willing to point it out and write an article to kind of counter that argument. One thing that's extremely important in debate is that it teaches you, when you find an author who's advocating for a position that you want to argue for, to also do the other side of that research and find the author who's also advocating for the opposite position. And that's something that's extremely valuable when determining the validity of an argument, because you can use the research that you gain on the other side to then determine if the argument that you're making in the first place is valid or not, or if there's some drawback that you might not have considered in the first place. Usually when we're looking at these arguments and kind of articles we want to cite, the way we determine whether something might be true or the degree in which it is true is to use things like statistics, what other people think about that argument, to kind of determine if the author might be skewed by some sort of bias or financial interest that might kind of influence the articles that they're writing. Debate focuses on argumentation, and the most important part of that is identifying fallacies at the most basic level, and then being able to articulate that in a way so that other people might not fall prey to that same fallacy, and also making your argument in a way that it is using sound arguments and valid arguments that can be persuasive. Ultimately, there are a lot of different strategies that can be used to identify information, but focusing on things like peer review and other things in policy debate have been extremely helpful and can be used even in other fields, not just in competitive debate. I think that's all we've got. Really appreciate the opportunity to present.
Thank you so much. Tarun, we'll move to you.
Thank you, everyone. So I'll let me see if I can get this full screen. So can everyone see this now? Okay, good. Thank you so much. So I'll focus on some of the things that the previous speakers mentioned about trying to model these things a little more rigorously, or to try to understand the what will happen a little more carefully. So what I'll do is give you the main ideas of how to think about the proliferation of misinformation using social media as an example. So a motivating question for this research was, why is it that in a society where the long run prevalent view is that elections are run fairly, millions of people quickly start to believe the opposite? And interestingly, with little or no proof, based solely on the utterances of a small group of people. So one way this can happen is with the quick spread of misinformation in connected networks using local and global effects. So I'll talk about these now. So that's what we use modeling, mathematical modeling, to study these effects. So what do we mean by local effects? We have some behavioral ideas about how people might believe particular narratives. So the local effect aspect is that each of us is going to make some decentralized choices, whether in this case, whether to believe a particular narrative or not. And importantly, and this is the behavioral aspect, our choices are influenced by those of our family and friends. And in turn, we influence theirs. So that's an observation, that's a behavioral assumption that we make. And so what's going to happen in this case is if some people, for whatever reason, believe a false narrative, then some of their friends are going to believe it as well, and their actions in turn may affect more people. So that's what we'll call a local effect, the interdependence among individual choices in our network of friends. Now, the behavioral foundation for global effect is that collective social outcomes affect our decisions as well. So, for example, each of us is more likely to believe in a narrative or to take a particular action if many others in society are making the same choice. So, if for whatever reason, if a large number of people start to believe a false narrative and it's shared widely, then any given person is also more likely to believe it separately from the local effect, separately from what our friends are believing. So that's a global effect. And our actions contribute to this indirectly. So what's going to happen, and the global effects is what we are formalizing. That's a new part in networks that we are formalizing in this research. So each person's decision to believe a false narrative is influenced both by local and global effects, and in turn contributes to this effects. So what we show is that mathematically, when you model this, and the paper has all the details and more, mathematical logic will imply that the stronger one effect is, the bigger is its impact on the other, making the other effect stronger, and then the consequent total effect even larger. This is what gives rise to cascading chain reactions that can start from a small group and influence a larger part of society. So where online social networks come in is that they just speed up everything. So an attack, for example, on election integrity, promoted by a small group of people, spreads quickly to local connections. Then social networks are seeking to increase engagement, and so their automated algorithms amplify this. This strengthens the global effects, leading more people to believe the narrative, setting off another chain reaction through their friends. And once you add in some of the things that were mentioned, automated account, repeated utterances of influencers, a fraudulent narrative can escalate swiftly. And in the case of something like election integrity, you only need to convince a small minority of voters for it to have an impact on an election. And so from here on, it can be a small further incendiary step to move this to a physical assault. So we saw this January 6th. We recently saw this in Brazil. I think there are several other instances. Maria Ressa has explained those as well. So that's the idea. Now let me give you a little more of how does this work. So here's a small 25-player network. So you'll see 25 nodes, each connected to each others, and the connections are determined in a way that's consistent with what we believe social media works. And we'll pick 5 nodes that have decided that they are going to believe a different narrative than the rest of the world. So the other 20 nodes at black are believing one narrative. 5 have switched to, the red ones have switched to a new ones. The numbers that you'll see, I'll talk a little bit about Q. Q is a measure of local effect. It's going to give me a fraction of my neighbors that need to flip before I flip. So that's, you can keep that in mind. I'll get to this in a couple of minutes again. So 5 flip, and this will be the next person. If 61% of their neighbors flip, 0.611 fraction, they will flip. So they'll be the next person to flip. Then the next one is, this one only requires 55.8 of their neighbors to flip, they flip. This requires 55.7 of their neighbors to flip, they flip. And then still 55.7, then this one flips. Then another 10 flip, and now it's taken off. Still at 55.7% as a parameter. I'll talk about that. And then the whole network is affected. So in this particular example, with this network and with this starting sets of 5 people, if we believe that people will flip their position when a little more than half of their neighbors flip, then everyone will flip in this network. So that's the type of stuff that can happen. And this is just now, it's just mathematical modeling. So given the behavioral assumptions, this is what's going to happen. Now, so we do lots of simulations, about 1.7, 1.8 million simulations are presented in the paper. Many more we conducted as part of the research. I'll just take you through these 2 panels, B and E. So B is the panel when only local effects, global effects are 0. And E is the panel when there is also local and global effects. Q equals 0.5 says, I'll flip when half of my neighbors flip. So the x-axis is giving me starting set size, like you saw 5 out of 25, which was 20% as a fraction of the total network. And the heavy line, and that's all I'll focus on, gives me how far contagion will spread if you start from a given starting set following this logic. So any lines that you see on the diagonal, contagion is not going to go anywhere. If 20%, in this case, 20% of the people flip in a 1,000-player network, it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to stay there if there's only local effects. But if there's global effects at 22, 23%, it can actually go all the way up. So what you see is that without global effects. This is, amplifying news, telling people, even if you're not connected to them, what's going on in the different parts of the network. If you don't have that, then there's a longer period, longer range of starting sets for which there is no contagion, then gradual to steepening, and then full contagion. When you allow global effects, that shifts it. Contagion can start earlier, and importantly, there's a very narrow range of starting set sizes in which you can control it. It's going to blow up much faster. And this we observe all over the place, no matter how we run this. The panel C and F are what I'll call a strongly resilient network. 3/4 of my neighbors need to flip before I flip. So, for the most part, if people keep flipping, crazies are crazies, let them flip. And then there's after it's 56-60% of the network, it starts to take off. But if I allow global effects, even in a highly resilient network, after about 30-33%, everyone is going to be affected. So that's the type of stuff that we were very surprised to see, that the impact of global effect has on the depth of contagion. Otherwise, in a very standard decentralized decision-making framework, everyone trying to do the best they can. So almost out of time. We can reverse the process too. I'll skip that and just give you some of the policy implications. So what we see is, of course, starting set sizes and global effects amplify each other, the effect that each other has. What this does is it gives you some theoretical justification that you do need more aggressive policies to identify and limit accounts that are designed mainly to spread misinformation. Then there's also the synergy between local and global effects that I just talked about. So that means, so this provides some additional theoretical impetus for curtailing cross-network proliferation of unverified news, because the global effect will really kick things up. And lastly, when you put all three together, automated accounts, starting set sizes are large, local effects and global effects, now we get these steeper depth of contagion functions. And so this is what it was in some sense very concerning to us, that it's actually in the locally more resilient networks. So that the global effect, when you open them up to this, to these global effects, that you're going to see the largest contribution. That's really going to, so this type of a picture, this is, you see 60-70%, nothing's going to happen, whereas 30%, and you're going to get the whole network. So this is was a little bit concerning. And then again, many times you're not trying to infect the whole network, you're only trying to infect part of the network, and that may be even easier to achieve. So this gives us so we are saying that it's policies to control misinformation take on greater immediacy if the goal is to influence a small part of the network. So that's it. We model the behavioral incentives of both local and global effects. We show that there are some natural synergies between starting sets, local effects, and global effects. And this can really kick things up. And online, once you add social media networks, it can really spread very fast. So if you're not going to do anything about it, and there's a lot of people will say, no, it's open, anyone can say anything they want. Well, then you're going to have these sorts of conclusions. So you can't have both. So yeah, so that's what we were talking about.
Thank you so much. And maybe we can link your article too in the chat. I'll look for it so we can post it.
Yes.
I'll find it. Don't worry.
Yes,
Carmen?
and let me do that too.
Oh,
If I
okay.
can.
Thank
Yeah, I should have it somewhere. We have a couple of places.
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Okay.
Okay, can everybody see my slides? Oops, am I still muted?
You're good. Oh, good.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I really appreciate everybody's comments so far. And I'm glad I'm not planning on reiterating everything, but probably just giving a librarian's perspective on this. So when Emily first asked me to talk. She said that she asked me to think about strategies to identify misinformation, resources to learn more, and or priorities, challenges that librarians are facing now in helping patrons use credible sources. I just want to put a little caveat in that, we've always dealt with people trying to use credible sources, and that it's always been an issue, and that unfortunately the speed at which information is transferred is a huge challenge. So I'm going to tell a quick story here to help illustrate this, and I intentionally have picked something that is not very controversial and that has been well documented for many decades now. And so I'm going to, this is one very short version of this story. I could easily have picked more, but Hugh Bennett gained the support of Congress with the help of a perfectly timed storm from the planes that hit Washington, D.C., just as Bennett was testifying before a congressional committee. I have put in the slide here some actual factual information that comes out of a scholarly article that was published in 2010. And that I forgot the second part of the story, which is experiencing the dust storm for the first time in the Capitol, which is actually not true. Congress was motivated to begin action on legislation to address national erosion problems through a focus on improving farming techniques. So this is just one of those published versions of this very sensational story that uses a dramatic event, supposedly helping to have a direct cause in a political victory. And as I mentioned, this is definitely inaccurate, and it's full of misinformation that has been re-shared over and over again. So while this story was from 1935, I can imagine that this story would be easily blown up on social media and in the press today. I don't have time to share additional stories, or versions of the story, but so that to help understand some of the details of this. In 2010, Douglas Holmes, who is a national historian at the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in DC, wrote an article that attempted to set the record straight on this particular story. To the extent that the information that exists regarding the details, Helms stated that most accounts of events in the hearing room are secondhand based on conversations with Bennett. Some of the details and embellishments conflict with the actual events, and there are few firsthand accounts by Bennett. He goes on to say that, quote, recounting the successful campaign for a soil conservation agency at a lecture in 1959, Bennett recalled, quote, there were other incidents such as the timely arrival of a dust storm during the committee hearings, end quote. Helms, after a deep accounting of using primary resources and secondary resources, concluded that, quote, in retrospect, passage of the legislation was hardly a predictable outcome, despite Bennett's intense desire for such an agency. Now, this story, I should point out, really is a legend and is repeated over and over again with a lot of different embellishments, a lot of confusion about the facts, but it just continues to perpetuate despite Helms' attempt to set the record straight on this. So now I want to turn to the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. This is a document that helps ground the work that I do as a librarian, doing instruction and information literacy instruction. And information literacy is defined as a set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. I'm going to show in the next few slides the 6 frames of that, with a little bit of highlights from direct quotes from that document. These are not my words on the slides. So this first frame, authority is constructed and contextual. When we think about the story, for Helms to tell his story objectively and accurately, Helms had to question the father of soil conservation. Hugh Bennett's authority was well established. He was a soil erosion scholarly expert. He became the first head of the Soil Conservation Service, and he was also a key participant in the policymaking process. In the next frame here, the information creation as process, there's many inaccuracies can be attributed to choices of trusted resources used by the authors. If additional types of information resources, especially primary resources materials, were consulted, perhaps there would have been fewer errors continuously repeated. The next frame, information has value, is at the heart of this story. Information has value for persuasion, even when the information is not accurate, which is very clearly stated by all the previous panelists here. Helms was also privileged to have easy access to primary documents. His account cites newspapers, hearing transcripts, and even archival records such as telegrams. One of the ironies I see in the story of misinformation is that some key documentation, such as the hearing transcripts, were published and distributed to federal depository libraries throughout the United States. KU holds one of those federal depository libraries, and so a person could, in theory, fairly easily look at that documentation, but most authors did not cite that. In the frame, research as inquiry, in some ways it is not a big deal that the story is inaccurately told, but the frame research as inquiry asks us to consider just how easy it is to inaccurately retell the stories using our own words. It is easy to misuse resources to draw reasonable conclusions and still be inaccurate. Then the next frame, scholarship is conversation. The story I shared illustrates how easily it is for us to value the information from within our own network or discipline. And you guys did a great job of talking about that network influence. And at the same time, be very unaware of our own biases that cloud our ability to critically evaluate information and question authority. The frame also calls on us as consumers of information to be responsible information creators who try to use credible sources and avoid spreading misinformation. And then finally, the last frame here is searching as strategic exploration. And although these frames are listed alphabetically, this last conceptual frame is a great segue to conclude my remarks here, in that searching as strategic exploration notes, among other things, that we should seek guidance from experts such as librarians, and researchers and other professionals. And so I'm going to end here with just a few resources that I would encourage you to look at. I don't recommend any one specific, here's a checklist of everything you can do and you're going to avoid sending off misinformation or not recognizing it. The first is to please look at the KU Library's website. If you scroll down and start exploring those different tabs, there's lots of LibGuides, library guides that talk about different resources. We have video tutorials. If you have a specific question, please fill in the form and ask for assistance. And then librarians like myself, we're happy to come in and work with you to design class instruction specific to your assignments. We have research support that ranges any type of research you're working on, trying to get you to the right resources. And I have colleagues that are experts in systematic reviews of literature, and colleagues that are also experts in publication and keeping your copyright and stuff like that. So these additional resources I want to mention here very quickly. First of all, that framework, you're welcome to go in and read that framework. I reread this at least once a year, if not more than that, just to help keep me in tune to look for ways to improve information literacy for everyone. The next one is a study and resources put out by the Stanford Education Research Group. They have coined the phrase lateral reading, which the debaters were clearly illustrating when they were talking about going out, looking for additional information, get off of that page, open up more tabs and start investigating who's creating this, what's their motive for creating this information. The next one is somewhat related. This is a concept of shift. The first one being stop and think about how much you're being sucked into the sensationalness of the information you're reading. And it goes into tracing back to that original source. And then I wanted to also point out, if people are not aware of it, there's a nonprofit called Retraction Watch that blogs about scholarly content that has been retracted, articles that are being removed from some of our resources like Web of Science. And you can search for specific articles and see if there's been any retraction on any of those articles. And if you're a user of EndNote or Zotero, EndNote and Zotero will interface with information from Retraction Watch and actually give you a notification that an article has been retracted. So those are just a little handful of resources. As a librarian, we tend to over provide information, and I'm going to try to stop there. And then finally, here's my references. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think that, at least speaking for myself, we could go deep on each one of these things. I have so many questions. Tarun, I'm not great at mathematical modeling, so I was trying to follow those different diagrams, and would love to hear more about how the debaters prepare. And, you know, Carmen, I can talk libraries forever and ever, but I think we only have time for a couple of questions, and then we'll see if anybody who's attending wants to chime in. I'm interested in, you know, the title for the event is Mis and Disinformation. So I'm interested in your experiences, and how do you tell? Does it matter? Do we care if something is intentionally trying to distort a discussion, or if it is truly mistaken? How do you try to unearth? Do you try to unearth those motives? And really, in any of your work, does it function differently if a message is consciously, you know, intentionally, maliciously wrong and misleading, or somewhat more incidentally? Can we unpack a little bit the title, looking at both mis and disinformation, please?
I can jump in on that just a little bit. There clearly is a difference between misinformation and disinformation. And I think that if someone's trying to unpack that disinformation, I think it's important to trace back to sources as much as possible. And there are tools that help you easily take an image and search the internet to see where the source of that image was. Not that everybody's sources are going to be clear, because they're going to contain misinformation. But, you know, taking quotes and figuring out where did that quote really come from. When there are primary resources that have processes that ensure accuracy, that those resources be used. So, you know, I intentionally picked this story to share because the transcripts of hearings have a very stringent process. There's been stenographers in the room recording content for decades. And for the fact that historians and journalists and others have ignored that as a source for verification is really troubling for me as a librarian.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any ways that you encounter dis and misinformation, and anything that you observe about how those perhaps differently motivated, but in other ways somewhat parallel processes are working in the different arenas where you're encountering them?
I kind of wonder too, just because I don't understand the structure of debate, if like how the competitions go, if that's like, do you lose points if someone is, how does that look for you if you encounter that?
Yeah, so I would say in a debate, you are like, each side is like making one argument that kind of like directly conflicts with the other side, and you present a lot of evidence. You usually are citing 20, 30, 40 articles in any given debate round to support your point. And one of the most like common ways that you will argue against the other team that you're debating is by calling their source like credibility into question. And so it's not something where like if you or the other team cite like some sort of like misinformation in one of your pieces of evidence that you will like be punished or like automatically lose or anything like that, but it's like kind of like a major argument that they can forward against your claim. And it's like a lot of times, you know, you'll talk about like your evidence being more recent is like a common argument you can make, but you can also say sometimes that, well, your evidence comes from like someone who's funded by this institute or has ties to this company, so they have like some sort of like financial incentive to be making the argument they're making. So it's not always like full on misinformation where we're attacking evidence credibility, but there's other kind of like forms of like or like ways you can call the credibility of someone else's evidence into question, and that can just like help you make your argument appear more credible or like make the other side look like they don't have good qualified evidence.
So Carmen, I took to heart your closing that there's not a checklist of things that we are supposed to do or not do to avoid falling victim to mis and disinformation. This is, however, this is educate and act. So I'm interested in if each one of you has any piece of advice. You know, Tarun, how do we construct networks that are more resilient to these kinds of distorting effects? Or, you know, for those of us who don't have all of the skills of, you know, expert debaters, like what are ways that we might scale some of those practices into our own navigation of information? So I get it that we don't get a checklist of, you know, green light, safe, and red light, avoid activities. That's not the way these information flows work. But how should we act and not act in this evolving and I think quite challenging, even perhaps treacherous information landscape?
Just a couple of thoughts. Designing networks for different resilience. This is an open question. I think this would be very nice to understand more rigorously. The research that I presented takes the standard version of networks that's been used to study social media. So in that sense, it's a baseline model. Now, what particular net? So what we can say is that opening up a network to global effects, so allowing people to see the things that are going on further away from their connections directly rather than indirectly through their connections is going to have an impact. So this much is clear. So if you want to stop, and actually the model itself is agnostic about whether what's being propagated is good or bad. You could be trying to propagate something good, like vaccine, get people to talk about their pictures of vaccines they took, or public figures taking the vaccine and so forth. So the model itself is can address both, is flexible enough to address both cases. But so the general factors that are affecting is, well, if you allow for greater interaction, you're going to have greater impact. That's the broad part that's being formalized. Now, where this plays with misinformation or disinformation, whatever, or just different narrative than what may be actually true, is so it may be completely unintentional or maybe intentional, but if the social network has an incentive to keep you there, to keep you plugged in, then that has the further impact on proliferation. And that's, I think, the more sort of, in the particular case of social networks, that's the dynamic that I think I would worry about more. The argument is, well, people are interacting and we don't care what they write on social media. It's there, whatever you want to write is fine. And to the extent that we are only interacting with our friends, this is an argument that has greater weight. But the minute the social media modifies that content to amplify it, however they do it, to popular, trend, this, that, it is in some sense the social media itself, the algorithm or the construction or the business incentives have come into play in that communication. That part is, I think, needs to be understood better. There should be both the social media needs to be held accountable in whatever is the right manner, legislative, monetary, just better guardrails, whatever is the right answer. There may be multitude of answers, a multitude of ways to do this. But the modification of the discussion online through the intermediary, with the intermediary doing things that are benefiting them, I think this part is important to understand. So that's also an important research question that can further address what sorts of networks or what sorts of policies, what sorts of interaction behaviors, what sort of algorithmic content will serve to either speed or slow things down. Anyways, so that's just.
Melinda, just go back to that idea of a checklist. It's not like there haven't been attempts to have checklists, and there's one that's called CRAP, and right off the top of my head, I can't remember what all it stands for. But one of the problems with having this idea, oh, all I have to do is check off these certain things and everything is fine, is that they're not comprehensive and they're not looked at enough critically. And so students in high school might learn how to use the CRAP test, and they'll be in turn thinking that, well, something it's current, that helps. It appears to be from someplace credible, but if we don't stop and really think more deeply about the motivations, which I think all of us have been talking about for that information to be shared in the first place, the systems behind the information, how it's being constructed. So the way social media is, as Tarun said, is keeping us on those networks. If we don't think critically about the platforms we're using and the business models that are perpetuating the false information being spread, then it's difficult. So I try to resist having just a checklist and try to get people to constantly be vigilant about their information seeking practices.
Thank you. Any debaters, any advice you have for those who are going to be in the exchange of idea business, perhaps not on such a high stakes arena as you all, but in our own pursuits?
Yeah, the thing I would say is I really liked Jet's idea, and also Carmen brought it up, this idea of like lateral reading. That's what I find to be the most helpful when I'm encountering any sort of like misinformation or just like new information on social media and in the news, is I really try to just do my own research on it. Even something as simple as like I see something on social media and I quickly Google it and I read, like, skim through an article, and then I try to find an article on like the opposite view on the issue. And just doing that itself, I can like pretty easily identify, like, sometimes you'll just look it up and you'll find immediately, whoa, okay, like people have fact checked this and it's completely wrong. Or you'll like get to read a little bit more and develop your own opinion on it. It's really just avoiding seeing like something on social media and immediately taking it as true, or just like not looking any further into it. That's a big problem.
Thank you. And to Tarun's point, immediately sharing it too, right, Michael? Emily, are there any other questions? We've only got a couple more minutes, but anything else that you want to highlight, or any kind of parting thoughts from our presenters here?
I was curious if I haven't seen any other questions yet, but I'm just curious. So we have a link to be able to read Tarun's article, and Carmen's offered us a lot of resources in the chat. I'm wondering for Michael and Jet and Sabrina, if there's a way we can keep up with what you're doing through debate. Like, how can we be supportive? I know that you're in the process of competing and that kind of thing. How do we access what you're up to?
Yeah, for sure. I think the best way probably is there's a Kansas Debate Twitter that our coaches can really update when we're at tournaments. And so we're getting towards the end of our season. So we have 2 more tournaments. There's the National Debate Tournament, and then there's another national tournament called the CIDA Tournament, where during the weekend when we'll be competing, there'll be pictures, results, updates that come out. Also, our coach, Dr. Scott Harris, usually writes press releases after every tournament, and those can be found on the KU News website.
Thank you so much. I can also share, so this is a topic, misinformation and the threats therein, is a topic that's really popular right now. I know I've seen a number of other events going on, and we actually, the Commons is part of another series too about misinformation that connects with wellness and democracy. Thank you for sharing that link, Michael. And so we have a couple of events coming up still in that series, and I think this conversation has been really helpful in trying to think about what the direct interface for humans and misinformation can look like. And then this other series is sort of looking at like what the implications and consequences can be if not addressed. So we had an event last night about indigenous communities, Native communities, and also LGBTQ populations, and how specifically misinformation has caused harm. The next in that series is about climate change and misinformation, disinformation, and that'll be on April 12th if you're interested. But I just wanted to thank you all, because I think you've brought up a lot of really important points too about incentives for misinformation and disinformation that I haven't been thinking as much about, as people are seeking power or finances or whatever it is that they're resorting to these ways of doing it. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you all. Thank you so much, Melinda, too, for hosting the conversation. Any other parting thoughts? I don't want to necessarily have the last word, but. That's the assured way for me to have the last word, is to say that. So, okay. Well, thanks again, everybody. It was really wonderful to hear from you and learn from you today. Take care.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks.